Turning that on now. There we go. Okay, and let me get up my PowerPoint. Okay. Oops, but here we are in the middle of it instead of the beginning. Okay. And I'm going to go to, okay, there we go. All right. So just to tell you a little bit about what we're going to try to cover tonight. In the audience here, among you, we probably have people who are total tree experts, know all kinds of everything about trees. And then we probably also have people who, they just love trees because they're beautiful. And, that was the motivation for coming out tonight. So kind of a variety of how much people know about them, and especially how much people might know about them in regards to climate change, which I do work for Thurston Climate Action Team. So a lot of what has brought us to have concern about trees is their spectacular role in helping us out of the climate catastrophe. So I also, as some of you saw Rebecca at the beginning here, Rebecca is TCAT's intern. So I've asked Rebecca to play, she's waving at you. I've asked her to play a particular role tonight, which is to monitor the chat box. So as I'm going along, if you have a question, put it in the chat box so you won't forget it by the end of the thing. And I've asked Rebecca to kind of interrupt me with questions that relate to exactly what I'm talking about at the moment, because I think that's the best way to integrate those questions. And then other questions that maybe are not related to what's being spoken about, we'll take at the end. So also to give you a little sense of where we're going, the first half of this presentation will be about trees and their role in climate. After that, I will switch to talking about our tree action group in particular, kind of what the work is that we've been doing, and sort of what role you could play in helping to do that work. So, and I'm just, somebody maybe is unmuted because there's background noise. Yeah, Benny, I'm going to ask you to mute because we're getting some background noise there. So, okay. So just a little bit about what is TCAT. You can see there our mission statement. Thurston Climate Action Team brings our community together to reduce climate disruption, resulting in a healthy, just, and prosperous future for all. And some of the things that we've done in the past is we've created our county's emissions inventory, which has been used for years by the local jurisdictions. We helped initiate and get past the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, and that is a plan joined into jointly by the county, Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater, and it just passed in January and February, and now we're pushing for its implementation. So we have action groups, and each of those is made up of volunteers who are working on different parts of the climate problem. We have one on buildings, green buildings, one on transportation that's focused a great deal on electric vehicles. We have a new one on food and agriculture. We have this tree one, which you're visiting today. We have one on advocacy, and we have one on youth, which Rebecca is part of. So, benefits of urban trees. So, people often just think, oh, trees are beautiful and wonderful, and they don't know about all the amazing things they do. So, one thing is that they remove pollutants from the air. They also help cool our everything around them, and so prevent heat islands. They have all kinds of health benefits, one of the primary being reducing asthma by improving air quality. They help with biodiversity by providing habitat for birds and small mammals and pollinators. They encourage people to exercise. They manage stormwater, which here in the Northwest, with all the rain we have, is a big deal. They actually studies show they increase the property value of a house when it sells, and they reduce depression. Studies show if people can see even one tree out of their window, they're less likely to have depression. We very specifically work on trees because they are a climate solution. They are a carbon sink. So trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The carbon is stored in the roots and in the soil, thereby reducing emissions. They also sequester, so they're both drawing down, which is sequestering, and they're storing. And both of those help. Trees take the CO2, a greenhouse gas, and in exchange they transpire oxygen, which we breathe. So they're literally the lungs of the planet. Street trees in Olympia collectively sequester more than 420,000 pounds of carbon every year, and that's just the street trees, not all the ones in people's backyards. Each tree on average stores over 2,000 pounds of carbon over its lifetime. Street trees in Olympia have stored more than 5 million pounds of carbon. So I already mentioned about the lower asthma rates as a result of trees taking the pollution out. This is particularly important in low-income neighborhoods. They tend to have fewer trees and then higher asthma rates. So this is also a climate justice issue. That is a picture of Olympia, and the red areas are where it's the hottest. So cities are heat islands because of the amount of asphalt that we have. The temperatures can be as much as 12 degrees higher in the summertime, and trees have a cooling impact. So they help bring down the temperature and reduce air conditioning costs. And that's just a little bit about how they do that. When a tree is within 6 feet of a building, it both cools in the winter and also, ironically or counterintuitively, helps keep it warmer in the winter. And so as a result, each tree is generating about $330 of energy savings per year per tree. So another plus for our trees. And then they also help with flooding. Because they take in water as it's running by, they help soak it up so it doesn't just run down the street and create a big flood, which, we're in increasing danger of as climate change proceeds. There are mechanical ways that cities try to do stormwater management, and those are much more expensive than trees are. The clouds in this photo are a result of transpiration, the release of moisture by the leaves of trees. By so doing, trees help maintain moisture in the soil and atmosphere, supporting each other and the understory plant life. So they're an important way that we avoid drought and desertification, both of which are higher risks with climate change. And then, of course, just other benefits that have nothing to do with climate change is bird, mammal, critical habitat, the mental health benefits I mentioned earlier, and beauty and increasing of home values. So annually in Thurston County, our trees are drawing down 2.7% of our total emissions. obviously we have a lot more emissions, but it's hard to find any silver bullet thing, and so 2.7 is actually pretty darn good. And our countywide trees are holding roughly 14 years worth of total emissions. No one would ever cut all the trees down at once, but you can kind of see clear cutting is a disaster when you've got that much stored carbon. So our science-based mitigation plan could not get there without adding a lot of trees. So in other words, when we created the carbon mitigation plan, they were trying to just find different ways of reducing emissions, and they couldn't get to the goals by just reducing emissions. They had to also add in the sequestering of trees to get to the target goal. So what the carbon mitigation plan has in it that has to do with trees is three things: afforestation, which means planting of more trees; tree canopy preservation; and then municipal canopy, some directions to the cities about how they should maintain their trees that they own, like the city tree, street trees. So big trees versus small trees. This is kind of an area that a lot of people have confusion about. You'll hear people talk about it like, oh, you know, they're developing this lot, they're going to cut all the trees down on it, and then they'll plant new ones. And people sometimes think that's kind of a one-for-one thing, that you can, you know, cut down that number of trees and then replant it with the same number. But it doesn't really work that way. Older trees draw down more carbon than smaller trees. Trees increase their rate of carbon storage each year well beyond the 100 years. And this is why we work on first protecting the small ones and planting second. Planting is good. We need to have even more trees than we have. But those really big ones, we can't get there. If it took a tree 200 years to get to that level of efficiency, we can't plant new ones to get there. So what has this tree action group been doing? We were formed in April of 2019. We have monthly meetings. We reviewed all 4 jurisdictions' tree ordinances to see what did they say, how do they attempt to, you know, protect the trees. We concluded that Lacey's was the best, then Tumwater's, then Olympia's, and then the counties. Counties is so bad that the county staff couldn't even explain to Commissioner Mentzner what the rules were. They could not come up with what they were. So we also then prepared best practices documents. So we reviewed what some other cities in our jurisdiction do to protect trees, found what we thought were the best ways, and put that into a document. We've had several fights, which you'll hear about a little bit later. One around a development project the Port of Olympia is trying to do, one that Tumwater has started now around 92nd Street, and also with Lacey, which was updating their urban forestry plan, but actually rolling back their protections. And we did manage to stop the rollback, so that's really great. And now we've just created a model ordinance, which we are going to be bringing to the jurisdictions to try to get them to adopt it. It's like our suggestions of what we think would be an improvement. So why are we working on tree ordinances? Well, without them, anyone can cut down any tree. With them and without any enforcement, anyone can cut down any tree. So we've got to both pass ordinances and make sure that they're enforced. Development is increasingly coming to our county and will result in massive clear cutting if we don't get any rules in place. Trees are climate solutions and the lungs of our ecosystem. They protect us, so we should protect them. How good the ordinance is matters. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about what our group is looking for in an ordinance. So currently all 4 jurisdictions have what we call a floor model, and we're asking them to replace it with a tree canopy and permitting model. So when I say a floor model, what I mean by that is they each prescribe in them for different size single-family units, acreages, how many trees is the minimum number of trees you need to have on a lot that size. They also say for commercial lots and industrial lots and that sort of thing, what the minimum number is. But when you have that, it means that anything above that, a person can cut down to the minimum. And the minimums that they all have are really small. Like on an average lot in Olympia, it requires 5 trees. So you might have 2 in the front yard and 3 in the backyard. Most people actually have quite a few more trees than that. So that number is in no way a protection. It really basically is a license to go ahead and cut whatever you want. And an example of what happens when you have this kind of floor method is Lacey has just recently reported that in the last 15 years, they lost, whoops, oh dear, that was not what I wanted to do. In the last 15 years, they lost 15% of the tree coverage they had. So just counting land that was covered in trees, not total land that was not covered in trees, of their covered lands, they lost 15%. So that's quite significant. And for those of you who've lived in Lacey, you've probably noticed the trees disappearing. And, you know, Olympia and Tumwater have not produced similar information, but I think if they did, we would probably see a fairly similar level of loss going on. Lacey also did a survey of citizens about how they felt about their trees, and 70% of the citizens wanted enforcement or stronger tree protections. So I think that's a pretty strong indicator of how people are feeling about what's going on. Lacey had a rule that said that you could only cut down 5 trees in 3 years. So that was sort of a decelerator on that floor thing I was talking about. It meant that if you had, we'll say, 15 trees on your property and the minimum is 5, so you could cut down 10 of them. Well, not really, because you could only cut down 5 over 3 years. So it slowed down the cutting. But they were trying to remove that. And they were also trying to make a special permission that HOAs, homeowners associations, could cut down whatever they wanted to. So we fought them on both of those things. We said, you know, you're already losing 15% of your tree cover. Why would you want to get rid of one of your 2 ways of protecting trees? And why would you want to give HOAs special privileges that other people don't have? So, so far we've stopped them. It's unclear whether they're going to still keep pursuing those 2 things or not. I think we made enough fuss that they decided to drop those 2 things. We also, at the same time, got them to adopt a 28% tree canopy goal. So that's what they have right now, is 28% tree canopy. And so they've set as a goal to stay at that level. And then we also got them to decide to hire their arborist, who has for years and years and years been on contract only. And we got them to agree to set up a citizen-based urban forestry commission. So we are asking that they create tree designations. Why? What's a tree designation? So in most codes, an exceptional tree is one that is over 20 inches to 30 inches at breast height. So DBH means diameter at breast height. And as we already know, these really big trees sequester the most carbon. The largest 1 or 2% of trees do 50% of the work. So if you were going to protect any trees, protecting those biggest ones would be the most important thing to do. So we want them to start designating that trees that are over 20 inches are exceptional because we want to create stronger protections around those exceptional trees. Significant trees are smaller than exceptional trees and bigger than 6 inches. So trees that fall between 6 and 20 inches would be a significant tree. Trees that are just 35 years old, which tends to be the ones that fall into this significant category. Generally, ones older than 35 might be in the exceptional category. So trees that are 35 years old can hold 20 times more carbon than a 1-year-old if deciduous, and 15 to 30 times more if a conifer. That depends on the species of the tree. So again, you can see why we talk about protecting big trees over little trees. And then grove trees are trees where there are 8 trees contiguous, and at least one of them is an exceptional tree. And these trees support each other through their root systems. They're often more resistant against wind by standing together, and they are particularly where wildlife likes to hang out. And so we're also trying, when development happens, to protect grove trees. Historic trees is the one designation that our local jurisdictions already have. Generally speaking, historic trees are just what it says. It's a tree that is somehow got a claim to fame. It's somehow connected to our history. So an example is in Tumwater on the George Washington Bush settlement, which is the oldest settlement in the area. There's this butternut tree that's the biggest one anywhere in the state, and probably one of the larger ones in the nation. So it has a protected status because it's been given this historic designation. No one can just chop it down. Trees or development. This is kind of a framing that you'll hear a lot. People will kind of say like, well, we have to have development, and so that just means we have to cut down trees. And we say, no, that's a false framing. We have countywide a severe housing shortage, which is expected to get worse as population grows. So that does mean that we have to build more, but that does not mean that we have to justify developers doing whatever they want. A pretty typical way that builders go about developing a property is they come and they clear every tree off of it because it's easier for them to get in, get all their equipment in that way. They don't have to take any time navigating around trees or protecting the roots of the trees, and then they just stick a few little saplings on after they're done. But that is a matter of convenience for them. It doesn't have to be done that way, and especially if the plan is to have trees around the perimeter of the property, they really could develop by going in and taking down trees in the middle and leaving the ones around the fringe, and that's what we want to really encourage. And in this very cool picture that you can see here, you can see what happens when an architect actually respects a tree that was already there. That is a 330-year-old tree that they chose to protect by literally building the building around it, which I thought was really cool. So setbacks is the name for how much space you have to leave around a property that you don't have building on. And as cities get denser, they tend to make those setbacks smaller and smaller. And so we want to encourage that they keep big setbacks in our cities because that's really where the trees can live. And so they can build up with the building, but not out, and leave space for the trees. We're also asking for a major and minor permitting system. So major permits would be for new construction and remodeling, and replacement fees would have to be paid for trees that came down, and there would be bigger replacement fees for bigger trees. And so we're hoping by doing that to encourage builders to leave as many trees as possible in their plan so that they won't have to pay those replacement fees. But it does allow for some cutting so that the development can happen. Whereas for minor permitting, which would be just somebody in their neighborhood who wants to cut a tree down, it would be much more restrictive because it would allow for unhealthy or dying trees to be cut down or ones that block traffic, but not for people to just cut down a tree because, and I literally heard someone say that, my tree drops leaves, it's annoying. Yeah, that's not a good reason to cut a tree down. Enforcement, we're asking for staff to monitor permitting. And this is a pretty important thing because no matter what tree rules you have, if the city has no staff to enforce it with, then they have to rely on neighbor complaint, which means that the neighbors complained after the tree got cut down. Totally defeats the purpose, right? So we need to actually have permitting staff who fill out these permits, pay attention to what's happening, can be quickly responsive to a phone call, and we have to have fines for illegal cutting so that it starts to be known and onerous that if you cut down a tree that you're going to have a big fine. But the really thing that we want to do to make enforcement work is we want any tree cutting professional, whether it's a tree service or an arborist, to have to get a business license through the city where they would sign a statement saying that they have read the rules, they're aware of the rules, they agree to follow the rules. And, if there's 3 complaints of them illegally cutting down trees, they would lose their license. So this is the part where I'm going to talk about some of the tree battles that have gone on recently. So the Port of Olympia is currently proposing to lease 200 acres of land, of which 120 are forested. They are located near a residential neighborhood and a middle school. And they want to do this in order to make a warehouse. The negative impact would be huge because of the number of trees that would be cut down and stormwater services lost, etc. Oh, that last paragraph is outdated and you can ignore that. But this fight has been going on since the summer, and we do finally seem to be making some progress on this, and so it may be partly because Tumwater itself has pushed back on the port and said, this isn't what we want, and you're creating long-term problems for us, one of which is a huge stormwater problem. So it may be that this particular thing does not get to happen. A thing that did happen, which I'm telling you about because it has some implications for future struggles, is a company named Puget Western had 2 pieces of land on either side of I-5 at 92nd, and they want to build a 65-acre warehouse on one side of it. Think about the size of that, a 65-acre warehouse. I mean, that is gigantic. And in order to do that, they want to cut down, they did cut down 2,811 trees, which were storing 12,000 tons of carbon and sequestering 514 tons a year. So, that's just kind of tragic. But the goofy part of this story is there were pocket gophers living on both pieces of land. And any of you who are from Tumwater already know all about the gopher story. There are a lot of gophers in Tumwater, and they are an endangered species. And so if you develop an area that has gophers in it, you have to submit to the U.S. Wildlife and Fishery a gopher mitigation plan. You have to show what you're going to do in order to preserve gophers. And so they came up with this plan, which was, well, pretty goofy, where they said, well, they were going to build the warehouse on the bigger piece of land, and so that whole piece of land would be covered. All the gophers on that side would die, but they were going to keep the other piece of land as a permanent mitigation site for gophers. This doesn't really mean anything to all the dead gophers on the original site where the warehouse went. And U.S. Wildlife Fish and Wildlife has been pretty clear before that one of the biggest things leading to the gophers being endangered as a species is that their habitat keeps getting cut up. So it's doubtful to us that they will approve that mitigation plan. But basically the company lied to Tumwater and submitted their draft, which they had not even turned into U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but said that this was their mitigation plan, meaning that it was accepted when it was in fact a draft. And at the point that we pointed that out, they then quickly submitted it to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It takes about 6 months usually for them to make a decision on whether that's acceptable or not. And before any decision came back, they allowed Puget Western to go ahead and cut all the trees down. So probably by the time we find out that, like, no, that will not be an acceptable gopher mitigation plan, it won't matter because all the trees are already cut down. Why does this matter for future battles? The city feels that buying pieces of land that they will hold as permanently undeveloped as gopher mitigation will allow for development to happen in other parts of Tumwater where they want it to happen. And they also feel that by selectively buying where the gopher mitigation is, that they can protect certain other areas for mitigation. Unfortunately, the city is only focused on prairie as a mitigation and not trees as a mitigation. So a number of problems about how Tumwater is thinking about the situation right now. And then this one is coming up. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Capitol Forest. It's right here by Olympia, huge area of forest, which we think of as a state-owned park, basically a huge park that has a lot of old-growth trees on it. However, it is owned by the state, and the state has for decades used it as when they need to raise a little more money for the state school budget, they will log part of it and use those monies for the school district. And Washington's superintendent of schools has even spoke up and objected to this and said, like, you know, we got to figure out a different way to do this. We can't be doing this by killing trees. But nonetheless, that is still the method by which they're doing it. And so there is a planned auction of timber rights on this piece of land that you can see there on the map, which is in Capitol Forest. And last year they did a similar thing, and my daughter tells me that she and her friends were hiking in there, and then they came out on this opening and it was just clear cut. Really tragic. So you can see some wording over here about a petition that's recently gone in. If you come to next week's tree meeting, it is on our agenda, and we will be talking about what we can do both about this particular sale, but also what could maybe be done in the longer term picture to unlink a sale of land in Capitol Forest from the school's budget. So the mitigation plan in our work. So when the mitigation plan was being created, there was quite a bit of confusion that got created about trees during the process. Originally, they were only focused on things that would reduce emissions, and I kept saying, no, we've got to add sequestration in. And then at a certain point, the consultant who was doing the plan for them came and said, yeah, we can only get to our goals if we add in sequestration. And he made the suggestion at that time that they would have to stop all cutting in the county, and that they would have to plant 139 acres of trees. And people in the county sort of gulped and said, where are we going to find those many acres to plant trees on? It's my opinion that needs to be converted to an actual number of trees, because there's actually a lot of space for people to plant additional trees on their own property. But because he said no cutting, that quickly got pushed back on, because we do have to do development. We can't have zero cutting. So they removed that language out of there, but then they also sort of obscured the concept that we were going to have to really push way back on cutting. So there are a number of questions that are up in the air that the jurisdictions are trying to find answers to, so they know how to even implement the stuff that's in the mitigation plan about trees. So there is a expected white paper on this coming out, we think in this month or next. There has been this lack of clarity about how many trees need to be planted, and Tumwater managed to get thrown in at the very last minute that sequestration could also happen through prairies. And I just explained to you the weirdness about prairies and gophers. So that has to be sorted out. And they need to figure out where to plant all the trees they're going to plant. So there's, and then in general, they have not understood why we promote protecting trees over planting new saplings. So those are all things that we sort of try to lobby on in order to get more clarity for policymakers going forward. So what can you do? Well, one thing would be to come to our monthly meetings, because that's really where we figure out our strategy about how to approach these different things. And then there's lots of things that come out of those meetings where different people sort of say, I'll do that, or I'll call this person, or, so there's things to be done that kind of get divvied up at the meeting. You can be on a team that focuses on your jurisdiction. We've been sort of a generalist group so far, rushing over to Lacey and now over to Tumwater and stuff. But that's pretty exhausting for people, and I think really we need to have more people, and we need to specialize a little more in terms of focusing on where each of the jurisdictions is in their own process of trying to redo their ordinances. You can write letters when needed. A number of those fights that I mentioned before, we had key moments where we had to send in public comment and say, no, we don't want you to build a gigantic warehouse and cut all these trees down. You can help arrange and participate in tree plantings. We try to do tree plantings a couple times a year where we help get new trees in the ground. You can scout out a tree problem. Somebody needs to go over there and actually look at that area in Capitol Forest that they want to cut down. You can help educate the public about trees. There's a lot I was sharing with you tonight, but these are things that we need the general public to understand more clearly. Things like why big trees matter, or even that trees are a climate issue, or to understand all the benefits that trees have. And you can show up to protest a tree cutting. There's a guy who I was really hoping would come tonight, and he did not, who there was a gigantic tree that was right on the border of his property and his neighbor's property. And then they were developing his neighbor's property, and the developers were just bound and determined to cut that tree down. And according to Olympia City Ordinance, they were not to cut it down without his permission because he owned half the tree. And they came, and he was sitting there holding the tree, and they were cutting with a saw at the same time. They were just absolutely determined to cut that tree down. And he was very dismayed because he had tried to call various city officials and really just got kind of ignored by them. And I think it would take a whole group showing up, and also calling. I think when it was just him, they were able to just dismiss him and be like, oh yeah, that guy who's hung up on a tree. I think when you have a group of people, it becomes much harder to ignore. So that's why we have a tree action group. So we do have a volunteer application that my director requires. I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to see about questions. Oh, nobody wrote any questions in the chat. Okay, what questions do you have? Oh, what is an emissions inventory? So all kinds of activities we do create greenhouse gases. So when you drive your car, that creates it. When you are using electricity in your house, that creates it. Industry creates it. A zillion different things create it. And so a starting place for us trying to reduce greenhouse gases is we first have to be able to figure out, well, where are we emitting them, so we can figure out how we can then reduce our emissions in those different areas. So we created an inventory for our county. They've been using it now for, I think, about 6 years. So we have a picture of, where our emissions are. Our greatest emissions are in buildings, and then second in transportation. And then we have a little tiny sliver in agriculture. We're not a very agricultural county. So that's the answer to that question.
Follow up on that, Lynn. Is that like a database, or is that just like a statistical calculation of how many cars there are, how long did they commute? Therefore, there's this part of the emissions inventory, or is it more quantifiable and take it to legislature and say this actually is what is, not just what we think is? How does that inventory part work?
I do think that you're right that a lot of it is figured out by calculation, being able to say these are how many cars we have on the road, and the average per car per mile is this. So I do think it is figured out kind of that way. So there's certainly imprecision to that, but there are also standards for how you calculate this that are standardized across, so emissions inventories that are done across our entire country and actually the planet are done the same way. And so you are at least comparing apples to apples if you say ours are this and King County's are that. But, certain amount of it is certainly imprecise. The real goal, of course, is just for it to help us try to make better decisions and make changes so that we can get a hold of climate change.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. The imprecision. There's a collective okayness about the precision that either is or isn't there. So apples to apples, oranges to oranges is really what I was getting at. How sort of defensible is the argument if the other guy is using a whole different way of measuring stuff? So,
yeah.
Thank you.
No, we are using the same way. And ISIL, which is an international group that creates these standards, tweaks them every now and then to try to make them more precise, and then everybody uses the new clarification or new procedure. So I'm interested to hear from each of you maybe a little bit of reaction to what you heard. So I threw a lot of information at you, both about trees and also about our local tree struggles. And I just love to hear from each of you, what did you think when you were hearing about it?
I could give some good feedback. I really liked everything you said because currently I'm in college to do things like this. And so my mom helped me get involved in this. So it was really exciting to hear about it. I guess I just want to hear more about like, how do I get involved in like planting trees? Like, when's your next planting tree day? I know we're going into fall and winter. So do we wait until it comes back out to spring, or are you planning one for late October, or like how does that work? And like how do I get more involved in like helping that neighbor guy stop his tree or tree getting cut down? I really do want to like donate time if I can to like call
Yeah.
people.
Yeah, great. So tree planting season actually is November through March. So we're headed right into tree planting season. You haven't missed it. They kind of need to be planted in the more dormant part of their cycle. So, and we usually try to just partner with other organizations that are doing tree planting. So, like the last time we did one, we did it with the Nisqually River Foundation, but it turned out that their planting site was all the way out past Yelm. And so we kind of realized, oh, we spent so much time in the car. That was not like what we were aiming for. So I actually had a conversation with a different group that was going to be planting some trees on the west side of Puget Sound last year, and then that fell through right as they were trying to get it set up. And I need to actually be back in touch with them to try to see if we can get a November or February one set up. And that's the sort of thing that if somebody like yourself is really interested in it and can kind of help me work on getting it set up, then we're more likely to actually get the tree planting off the ground. And then in terms of things like, showing up when somebody is facing a tree cutting, like if you come to the meeting that's next week, we will be talking about that sale that is taking place in Capitol Forest and talking about what can we do to stop it. And it may be that one of the things we can do to stop it is have a very large visible protest of the fact that they're wanting to do it. And COVID, of course, has made things weird and funky. Like there's people who don't want to go outside right now, and for some understandable reasons. The cool thing is if you do a tree protest outside, you're at least outside, and it's really possible to get 6 feet away from each other. So that'll be one of our discussions is like, what should we do about that in order to, try to make a difference? And there are at different moments in time, all kinds of times where we need to write people. And there's also even been times where we've needed to go like meet with elected officials and talk to them and try to convince them about some of this. During the Lacey thing, we had to testify for 3 weeks in a row in front of the Planning Commission in order to get them to drop the bad rules and put in the good rules. And I think we're probably going to experience that with Tumwater in the next year. That's something I would love to I'd like to do a quick show of hands so I know who's from where. Is there anyone here from Tumwater? Raise your hand. Oh, great. I need some more Tumwater people. That's wonderful. Okay. Who here lives in Lacey and noticed the 15% of your trees getting cut down? Benny. Okay. Have you noticed the trees getting cut down? You're muted. You're muted.
Okay. Sorry about that. I noticed in the neighborhood when I was out with my dog just today, they were cutting down. And it's been a lot. We have a lot of, I live in Wedgwood, and there's a lot of trees around.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of homeowners that like to cut their trees down, and it makes all the other trees vulnerable, more and more vulnerable.
Yes.
For this. So definitely.
Yes.
I only lived there for 8 years, but I feel like I constantly hear
Yeah.
chains either close by or a little bit in the distance.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think, when we put that notice on next door, 30 different people responded to it. And that was a common reason people were responding to it, was they were saying, oh, every time I walk around my neighborhood, there's another tree being cut down, and people are pretty upset about it. So I want to ask Richard, Karen, James, and Zandra, are you guys Olympia folks?
This is Sandra. I am Olympia.
Okay.
This is James. I'm Olympia too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just outside of Olympia, unincorporated around Rich Road and Yelm Highway.
Okay, so you would be considered county then. And just to say, and Karen, where are you?
She's
Okay.
muted.
Yeah, she's muted. She'll have to unmute. Karen. Okay, well, maybe Karen will tell us in a minute or put into the chat box. So, Richard, just to tell you a little bit about the county situation, I mentioned that their ordinance was so bad that, the staff couldn't even tell the commissioner what it said. And so Commissioner Menzer has been a great ally for us and actually got it put onto their work plan that the staff would work on redoing the ordinance this year. They've had some staff turnover, which has slowed that down, but I met last week with the woman who's responsible for rewriting it. So we're going to see some, I think, proposals happening on the county level about how they might change their ordinance, and we're definitely going to need people who live in that area. So I'm really glad to meet you. And we're going to be needing to kind of raise our voices up and say, yes, we want this changed ordinance. And if we can influence the county one in a good way, the other jurisdictions may react to it by sort of trying to line up theirs a little bit more along the way that the county does. So that'll be great. Let's see. Linda put in the chat box a question about could the group meet later in the day, like 5, because our normal meetings are 3:30 to 5 or 5:30. And that is something I wanted to check with people about, is how many people in order to come would need it to be in the evening. So far, we've had a group of folks who I must admit are mostly retired or self-employed, and they have chosen that they want to meet in the day. So that's why we've been meeting at 3:30, but we're trying to make the group bigger. So if I hear that a whole bunch of you need it to be in the evening, I may be able then to persuade the group to change its regular time. So could I see hands raised of people who would need an evening meeting? Okay,
I don't
so
need
Ben,
it, but I prefer it.
okay, so Richard would prefer it. Benny needs it, and I take it Linda needs it as well, although she hasn't reappeared on the screen. There, she's raising her hand. Okay, all right, good. Okay. And Karen, anytime you want to put something in the chat so we know your thoughts, that'd be great. Okay, so I was in the process of asking people about your reactions to what you heard during the presentation. So I want to go back to that. What other thoughts did people have as you were listening to this? Go ahead, Sandra.
I want one of the things that was mentioned in your notes was enforcing codes. I can't remember the language, but that was what I took from it. Mm-hmm. And I certainly see that as a huge problem from my experience this summer and last winter, so over the last year in the city of Olympia. The urban forester is very willing to talk, very polite. But it started last winter. We had somebody directly southwest of our property that had companion trees to our trees that cut them down a week before a big windstorm. And so we had several $100s worth of damage on our property with limbs coming down that weren't bulked up to take that. And then to the southeast, we had several houses cut big fir trees and big blue spruce trees down during the spring and the summer. So then I had to spend thousands of dollars to have an urban forester come and climb through all the trees and try to get the trees, rather than having to take them down, try to get them, you do preventative work so that they could survive this winter. Each time I contacted our urban forester to let them know there were trees coming down, she seemed really concerned, but she never showed up. She never did anything. So I would like to see, I don't think that we will ever get any compliance with those city codes if there isn't any enforcement of them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I have talked with her too. And, the reality of the situation is for the entire city of Olympia, they have one person whose job it is to respond to all of those kind of calls, go out and look at situations and try to do something. Well, I mean, logically, and she only works 4 days a week. So logically, this is an impossibility, right? You couldn't possibly, with those number of hours, I mean, you can respond to emails and phone calls, which is kind of what she does. But yeah, she doesn't have enough time for enforcement. So, from my point of view, they've got to get serious about this. They're going to need to hire an enforcement officer. And I think she's pretty frustrated. Like from what I've heard her say, she kind of knows that she's not being able to do what is needed to be done. And I think, same thing where the Lacey person was like a contract person. They weren't even on payroll, right? And we just got that changed. But the cities have had, in general here, have had a posture of like, well, we don't want to tell citizens what to do. And so as a result of that, they deprioritize staffing and enforcement around this. And I think that the aspect of climate change is going to bring in a new pressure point that they haven't had before. I think the cities are now going to be able to justify for the first time doing the enforcement because it becomes an issue of they can't meet their climate goals if they don't do the enforcement. But it is also going to take the citizens showing up for the politicians to have enough backbone to like do the right thing. And that's, I think, what we saw in Lacey. They were going to just kind of go along with some bad suggestions that had been made to reduce their protections. And then when the citizens kept coming and kept testifying, sending letters in, well, then suddenly that became not a good idea. And then they didn't do it.
So in my situation, there were if someone had come out when the first tree came down, there would have been several others that wouldn't have come down. But
Right.
also finding the loggers that are doing it, because they know they should be the ones that are seeking permits before they're cutting. So
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's why I said that one of the critical things for enforcement is we need to make it that they have to be licensed with the city. And if they violate the rules, they lose their license. And there also needs to be fines that are paid by the tree cutter people. Because as long as they actually make money cutting trees, charging the homeowner to cut it down, then, they don't care. But if they start getting fined, well, then, that becomes a different matter.
So in probably 3 or 4 of the properties out of the 7 that cut down in the last 8 months are really close to my house, it was the same same company, which, you know, I did give our urban forester the name of. But so you're suggesting, from what you're saying, then maybe writing letters to city council and that kind of thing would be helpful.
Well, I think what we have to do is we have to do a coordinated effort, right? Like, you know, we have to try to get these ordinances changed to begin with so that they get enforcement teeth in them. And then we also, when there's a situation like you knew that was happening, that they were starting to cut on your block. Like if we could have a quick response team, like if 6 of us would jump in a car and drive over to someone's, you know, property when something like that was happening, and be like calling the city officials and making a flap with the tree cutters and stuff, I think it would start to change the situation. Right now, it's just, you know, people are really isolated, like that guy I described, all by himself, trying to stop, you know, the tree from getting cut down. So I think that you know, the more voices are raised up together, the more you can have an impact.
Okay.
Anybody else have a reaction they want to share to what they were hearing tonight?
I think one of the things that needs to be done is massive education.
Yes.
And that's just look at how many responses you got to the posting you put on next door that brought some people out of the woods enough to respond to what you said. You know, as much as I like trees and know a little bit about them and all that kind of stuff, I don't have the education background. In fact, you know, your slides were very, very good in terms of providing me, you know, some food for thought on what's going on with the trees and what their benefits are. But as a former teacher, I also, you know, recognize the need for education, and go back to my Chicago roots, that much of the Chicago area's lakefront was preserved because way back, before I was born, the Burnham was the name of the fellow. He created a group that went into the schools and educated the kids, took it to the parents, and eventually, instead of developing a beautiful lakefront that was in Chicago, it was well preserved.
Yeah.
In many cases. And so I always fall back on that particular principle as, you know, a need that's out there. So besides, I mean, you have to obviously attend the meetings and things like that, but even before a council meeting of some kind, that educational material is sent to the people on those councils or on those boards to get a chance to learn a little bit about what you're going to talk about when you get there. You know, what you stand for and why you stand for it. So,
yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Richard. Education is really key. I mean, when I think about Zandra's neighbors, I'm sure they did not understand the way trees protect each other, and that they're, you know, cutting down their trees, we're going to put her trees at risk. People don't understand very fundamental things about trees. I arrived at work one day to see the 5-year-old trees that my landlord had put into the building that my office was in. The yard people who mow our lawn were topping the trees.
Yeah.
And I was just horrified, and I, you know, rushed in and was trying to say to the landlord, they're topping the trees, you got to stop them, they're topping. He's like, what's the big deal, who cares? So they're topping the trees, you know. And I was trying to explain to him that this would make these trees permanently more vulnerable, that they would not be as healthy of a trees that he'd spent money, you know, putting them in the first place. Could not get through to him. All the time I sit in meetings where while they're discussing tree policies, people acknowledge that, well, these trees or that trees, they're going to get cut down, but don't worry, we'll plant some saplings in their place. And it just drives me crazy, that they don't understand the difference between a big tree and a little tree in terms of all the services that it's providing. And so that level of education, when the public would actually understand that you can't just replace a big tree with a little tree, then there would be a lot more voices objecting when someone comes up with that kind of idea in a policy-making setting. But I find that the policymakers do not understand that. And so we've got work to do to educate the city staffs and, the local politicians, et cetera. So, yeah, and, that gets into some of the kind of stuff we talk about in our meetings, which is how to get that education done and who can meet with this group of people and how can we reach out to neighborhood associations to be able to give a presentation to them, and how do we bring this information out to a wider circle of people. So this meeting has gone longer than I expected it to, and I am happy to stay and answer more questions if people have them, but I also don't want to make you stay beyond where you thought you were going to be. So I'll just quickly see, does anyone have a last minute question or comment that they want to make?
And this is James. Do you have like your PowerPoint presentation online? I don't absorb information as quickly as I did once, and it would be nice to go over all the information that you prepared so well.
Sure. Yeah, well, I am recording this, and as the meeting ends, I will end the recording, and then I will be posting it. So you should by tomorrow get a link for this. So you can feel free then to go back in and watch it again, or if you have a neighbor that you want to know this information, you can direct them to watch it too. So yeah, it will be available to everybody.
Excellent, thank you.
You're welcome. Benny, I saw you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
I was actually going to ask exactly the same question as James did, so good.
Great, good. Okay. Well, I want to thank my intern, Rebecca, whose job it was to monitor the chat. I'm afraid we didn't give her much of a job tonight, as it turned out, but I'm still really glad that she was here. So
we can say I did it very diligently.
You did do it very diligently. I agree. Yeah. All right. Well, so the next meeting is next Tuesday at 3:30. I will take up with the group at that time about whether they want to change the time. But I hope that those of you who were here tonight will decide to join that meeting. You have all been added to the listserv that we have, and so that should give you the link, which is correct, for that meeting. So I hope to see you again next week.
Thank you for your time and
much.
all that your organization does.
You're very welcome. Thanks for showing up.
Bye,
Yeah.
Lynn.
Bye-bye.
Great.